Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Greg Gerhardt. I'm Deputy Director at the State Water Resources Control Board for the Office of Information Management and Analysis. Welcome to this first annual Swamp Water Quality Science Symposium. Thank you all for coming, and especially thank you to Bev Anderson-Abbs. Raise your hand, Bev. Where are you? She's out in the other room. Yeah, chasing people down. Bev has been the conference or symposium director, so you'll see a lot of her, and we may even make her talk at some point. I also want to thank Chad Fearing, Calvin Yang, and Marissa Van Dyke, Lori Weber, Rich Brewer. A lot of people have been part of this team to prepare this, so I want to thank them all and acknowledge that. And Michelle, sorry, thank you. And anyone else that I forgot, sorry. So a couple of quick housekeeping things, and then I'm going to hand it over to Frank, who's going to give a rousing keynote speech, and then we're going to go into some more presentations. We'll have some breaks throughout the day. But first with the housekeeping. Number one, housekeeping for me is use a hashtag if you're going to tweet. So we have the intent to walk the walk with our own projects and use data to try to learn more about this. So the hashtag for this event, and you'll see it on a slide later, but it's hashtag California Water Data Dive, and it's the same one we've been using for our other data projects throughout the initiative. So California CA Water Data Dive. And the idea there is actually not just to see what kind of cool pictures you show, but to gather information about what we might want to talk about at the end of the day. So use that hashtag to not only post some questions or post provocative thoughts or just some keywords so that we can try to glean a little bit of information about what you're thinking about as you see some of the presentations today. So a couple more housekeeping, and then I'm going to hand it over to Frank. So first, the restrooms are on the outside as you go left out towards the Chihuly chandelier and around the corner. If there is an alarm, you'll hear an alarm and some instructions. Follow the instructions, but generally our gathering spot, go down the stairs that you probably came up and go gather at Cesar Chavez Park out across the way. So go out the main entrance and gather over there if you hear an alarm. What else? There's a cafeteria downstairs. If you need a snack, there's some breaks. We also, turn your phones off or down. Thanks. It's a nice big room, and actually we got this room for a lot of reasons, but it's really good because it does muffle some of the crowd noise a little bit. It's good acoustics, but still, if you could turn it down to vibrate or off. So with that, I'd like to introduce Frank. So Frank Loge is a professor at UC Davis. He's also the director of the Center for Water Energy Efficiency. He has his degrees from UC Davis, I believe, also. He's in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He's been working with us a lot this last 6 months. If I would have predicted who we would be collaborating with on some of our data stuff, I doubt I would have chosen a water energy connection, but it's been a real pleasure to work with him and to understand more about what his center is doing and to see sort of the cross connections, even if there's not a water quality cross connection, just to see some of the connections of sharing data, exploring how to use data in this age, and to inform our decision making. So with that, thank you very much for coming, Frank, to speak.
So good morning. So let me just give you a kind of a quick history of who I am. So I'm a civil engineer by training, and I've been in academics for like at least the last 16 years, roughly, and have changed my focus a couple times, my research focus a couple times. And so in putting together today this talk, I kind of drew upon all my experiences over my career in academics as a researcher. And so I'm going to kind of walk through kind of three broad areas related to data, and I'm going to make three big jumps here. And with each jump, I'm going to present some results or findings, and I'm going to skip all the details of how the data was collected and really focus on kind of a higher level conversation about data as it relates to water. So in starting this, let me say, so I did my dissertation on wastewater treatment, and I left my PhD program and moved up to Washington State. and did that for a couple years. And I realized that I didn't want to spend my life in a lab, and I really wanted to work with water that I could swim in and interact with, and wastewater was not that. So I switched my career quite a bit and began to focus. I was really interested on water and health, and so I began working with some fisheries biologists with NOAA Fisheries. And so I'm going to kind of step through, starting there, recognizing there's a lot of water quality and kind of biologists in the room, and I'm going to transition into some other areas that I've been more active in more recently that relate to water and energy and data. So, so if I have to start, so the first kind of starting point here, and this is just a schematic or a picture of an Excel spreadsheet. I don't intend for you to be able to read this at all. But the point here I want to make is that, so, the first stage of looking at data is what I refer to as this kind of individual investigator, or this perspective of an intentional collaboration. So this is when people come together, you have a project, you have the goal here of collecting data, and you all have an understanding of the type of data you're going to collect and how it's going to be used. And so generally the primary form of coalescing this data together is in a program like Excel. We think, in terms of rows and columns and how we organize our data. And I can remember much of my dissertation work, as well as the work early in my career around data, was focused on this. And I can distinctly remember having to move my data from Excel into a statistical program to run analysis, and I had to transform the data into a database, and I was really upset how difficult that was. But at the time, I thought in terms of rows and columns. I didn't really think in terms of databases. But in tying this together, so so when I started working for NOAA Fisheries, one of the things that I thought was really, really neat is not only did I have the opportunity to get out into the field and actually work in the field and not a laboratory, but I got exposed to a lot of very new things. So one of the projects that we worked on, which was a collaborative effort, but we all had a goal in mind of the type of data that we were going to collect. We were very interested in the interaction of fish, particularly spring Chinook salmon, the interaction with different types of things that cause stress that make them more susceptible to disease. So one of the things that we did early on was we went throughout, and this work was up in the Columbia River Basin, but we went throughout the Snake and Columbia rivers, and we collected fish at different points in the river system, and we brought them back to the lab, and we exposed them to a pathogen, Listonella anguillarum, and we assessed how susceptible they were to disease based on their life history or their exposures to the hydropower system. And what we got from that information was something similar to here, where you can see that the barge fish were less susceptible than the fish that were in river to exposure to this pathogen. So the implication is that the hydropower system in some way creates stress within these animals that make them more susceptible to disease. We then, and I won't show you data here, but then we then extended this work into chemicals and looking at chemical exposure, low-level, non-lethal exposures to chemicals, and their relationship to stress in the animal and ultimately their susceptibility to disease as well. So this was a large interdisciplinary effort. We collected a lot of information, but we all knew what that information was, and ultimately it ended up in a series of Excel spreadsheets that then we ran our analysis on. Once we did that work, we began to realize that there's a wealth of information that existed in the Columbia River collected by others. And so what's shown here is the lower, is the estuary proper. So out here is the Pacific Ocean. This is the estuary, and then you have the upper river, and then Bonneville Dam would be up here. So this is west, this is east, this is the at the estuary itself. And so when we began to look at taking our data and tying it into others, the first thing that we realized is that there were people out there that were collecting how fish move throughout the estuary, and they were using acoustic tags. And so they set up a series of hydrophones, and they collected information in terms of where fish were at certain times. So we said, that's a great data set. We want to pull that in. There was also a group of individuals with the USGS that were collecting data on the concentration of chemicals within the sediments. There was another group that was collecting information on the concentration within kind of the food web as a whole, as it led up to the fish that were eating the different forms of food. There was another group that was looking at habitat connectivity and restoration, and they had really good understandings of where fish went and why. So we began to pull all this information together. And this was not, and so I say here the title, you can see it there. So an unintentional collaboration. So we did not intend for this to happen, but we recognize that with the data we have, we can actually begin to make inferences of what the fish body burden was from eating different types of food that was exposed to different concentration of contaminants in the sediment. So we can actually begin to piece together the whole life history of this fish and begin to make inferences through math about the incidence of disease-induced mortality based on chemical exposure and then subsequent exposure to different types of pathogens. So that was great, and it was a huge, huge challenge to pull all this data together from all these disparate sources. And one of the first things that I found we always ask is, you say, oh, I wish these people collected this data. But the other thing that we quickly realized too is just the challenge of pulling all this data together and also using Excel as the rows and columns as the basis for organizing the data and beginning to analyze it. So we really began to transition into more robust databases like SQL database and things like that in order to house all this data. And then we began to move away from Excel as the analytical engine and began to write different types of scripts using R and other types of programs in order to analyze the data. So this activity lasted for 4 or 5 years, what I'm showing you here. So this is one slide, and there's many, many slides I can show you related to this. But out of this really grew my interest in big data, or data from a whole bunch of different sources and the power that it enables people to do. You can really draw together a number of different fields and a number of different studies and really begin to look at what the bigger picture is. So out of this too, I just wanted to highlight here. So from our work, we can make inferences about fish's exposure to chemicals and then the subsequent disease-induced mortality related to exposure to those chemicals. And then we began to look at the work that others had done related to body burdens of chemicals. And so this is just a list of different types of animals within the ocean or aquatic environments, or actually terrestrial as well. I see I have foxes down here. But different types of environments. So the number of people have done work on quantifying the exposure to chemicals of different animals and their body burdens of those chemicals. And so from our work, we can begin to make inferences about, not directly, but indirectly about the significance of those exposures. So we could so we're really using salmon as a model organism to understand what might happen in other types of populations. Okay, so now I'm going to make another big jump here. So I'm now moving from lab work to field work with unintentional merging of data together to this idea of the data world. And so, I mean, how many people here do work where you wish you had access to certain types of data that you just can't get access to? So a lot. So what I began to realize through my work, and now I've moved from Washington State University down to University of California at Davis. What I began to realize, and this is where I've invested about the last 10 years of my time here, so I have done a lot of work related to water and energy, but more broadly is looking at how we can enable access to data sets that people don't currently have access to. And that's ultimately what I'm going to end my talk with, is a recognition of kind of some of the key things that we need to work towards in order for that to happen. And I'll give you some examples along the way. But let me just start here. And I know this slide is a little busy, so let me just talk through it briefly. But if you look at the world of data and all the policies and laws that govern access to that data, you can begin to actually categorize that into 3 distinct categories, and that's what's shown here. So the first one, starting on your far right, says public or nations, and the intention here is secrecy. So this includes classified information, secret, top secret, that type of information, but it also includes a category of information that is relevant to many of us in this room, and from a legal perspective, it's called sensitive but unclassified information. Another way to say this is it's considered protected critical infrastructure information. So this is the location of, for a water utility, say, the location of its pumps and pipes, where it's important to to have this information, but you don't want everyone to know it. So what governs the sharing of this data really deals with the level of secrecy related to that. But the laws and policies around this then deal largely with preempting confidentiality and privacy. So in other words, so the three kind of things here that govern access to data are secrecy, confidentiality, and privacy. So if you work in the far right-hand box, all the laws essentially preempt, exclude the need to keep this information confidential and to deal with privacy issues. And the access to this largely is governed by the Department of Homeland Security. So that's one box, and that's actually the simplest box to work in because you don't have a lot of laws and policies governing that data. So as long as you can get access to the data, then you don't have to abide by a whole bunch of other rules. In the middle box, it's called what I've entitled internal operational practices. So let me ask you this. So how many people, when you have your phone, say an iPhone, and when you first start it, or when you first start it up, I mean, when you first buy it, you go through a series of screens that kind of lead you to, how much access can Apple have of your information, or how much access can different types of applications? So how many people even pay attention to that? Okay, so a fair number. And do most of you turn off all those features? Yes. And so the other half of you don't pay any attention at all. So what's happening here is, and this even extends into Facebook or your access to Google Maps. So even if you turn those features off, there's still applications that you use where they're collecting information about you. So anytime you turn on, if you have all those features turned off, anytime you turn on Google Maps, it's still collecting information as you as an individual and where you're going and what you're doing and how much time you're spending there. Google in turn, and then Apple's doing the same thing, Facebook's doing the same thing. All of those companies then use that information internal to their organization to improve their products, to improve the services they provide you. As an example, I personally don't pay a lot of attention to this, but every time I log on to my search engine, it has little ads there, specific to the things I'm interested in. So it's tailoring its services to me. But this is an example of internal operational practices. So this is an organization, whether it's a for-profit company or even a not-for-profit company like a water utility. So it's a publicly owned utility. They all have data and they all use that to improve their internal operational practices. So there's a set of policies and laws that govern that. So as long as you can abide by those, you, in theory, could have access to all that. And then on the far left-hand side is commercial data practices. I'm sorry, let me back up. So internal operational practices. So the guiding principle is confidentiality. So Google, in collecting all this information, when they share it with other entities within Google, they don't pay too much attention to ensuring the privacy of who you are. They're more concerned about ensuring the confidentiality of that data with their competitors. So the laws that govern this middle box really are about confidentiality. And then if you look at the third box on the left, that's commercial data practices. And there it's all, so now this is getting in the realm of Google, as an example, selling their information to a third party that's going to market to you for other reasons, would be an example of that. So now you have a whole different set of laws that really are focused on privacy that deal with that kind of sharing. But the concept here is, as long as you understand the policies and laws related to these three boxes, in concept, all of you can have access to that data. It's just a matter of A, getting someone to agree to share that data with you, and B, having a mechanism in place to ensure that you understand what those policies and laws are and that you abide by them. And that's largely where the work that we've been doing at UC Davis is focused currently, is setting up a system, a robust system, to actually enable this kind of data sharing across these three different boxes. And so let me just show you some examples now of that. So, but before I do that, let me just talk about a couple kind of key elements here in setting the system up like this that really enables robust data sharing. So the first thing that you need is what's called a trust framework. And a trust framework recognizes first that when you share data, you inevitably are taking on a level of risk. You can't ensure that sharing data with a certain person is going to be done in a way that is compliant with everything that you're supposed to be compliant with. So sharing data, it has a level of risk. So you need to have a trust framework in place that then defines what everyone's roles and responsibilities are. So this is just a high level kind of representation of a trust framework. So let me just, there's kind of 5 different bins here. So starting on the right, so this is the owner of the data. So the owner of the data is going to come and put their data into what I can call, I can refer to as a data lake or a data warehouse. But it's some sort of clearinghouse here of where the data goes. And there's a person that's responsible for cataloging the data and then giving access. This person in turn then puts data into what I'll refer to as like kitchens or labs, but this is a place then where all of us would come and run our analysis on the data. So once that happens, it gets kicked over into what we've referred to as the chef's table, but this is where the results then are looked at to make sure that they've been anonymized and aggregated and sanitized to whatever level is necessary according to the data owner, and then ultimately that data is published. So this is a conceptual representation of a trust framework. And it's important to note here, so when you begin to look at data in this way, you actually have to have a system in place where there's a number of roles and responsibilities for these different people. So you have the data owner, and then sometimes that owner can be also or a steward. So like if someone gives you data and you in turn then put it up in a place where it can be shared, you're the steward of that data, and now you're managing the data as the data owner, but you don't really own the data. You have here what I call a librarian, but this is, or you could think of it as the librarian, but this is the person that catalogs the data, controls access. You have people like us, the data scientists that are working in the kitchen, analyzing the data. You have, which is a very important feature, but you have different people who are auditors that make sure that you are compliant with all the rules and policies. And then finally, you have reviewers that review the results prior to being published to make sure that you're publishing things that are permitted to be published. So again, what I'm trying to give is a high-level picture of if you want to actually have access to data that you currently don't have access to, you need to begin to work in an environment like this where you have a trust framework in place. The trust framework recognizes all the policies and laws associated with these three different bins: secrecy data, or public data, or nation and public data, internal operational data, and commercial data practices. So let me just give you now a couple examples of us building this platform and beginning to populate it with data and the type of work that we can do. So now this is my third big jump here, which is now I'm jumping into an area that's probably not directly related to the work that most of you do in this room, but it is a good example of accessing a lot of different types of data and beginning to combine it together and doing analysis on that. So this first slide looks similar to the first one, but this slide is intended to recognize that water utilities have a lot of data that currently is very fragmented. It's housed within anywhere from 5 to 30 different databases within a water utility. So the first challenge here in beginning to want to work with water utilities and access different types of data is how do you combine all this data together into one common form? So we worked out a way to do that. But the examples I'm going to give you are related to us accessing water data from a water utility. And this includes personal identifiable information. So we have account level information of people's names, addresses, account numbers, and their water use. This also includes access to critical infrastructure information. So this is information related to their pumps and pipes and where they're located. And then a lot of information that then falls into other categories like information from their SCADA systems in terms of how their water utility functions. So in stepping into this, I'm going to give you kind of 3 really big examples. So the first example is related to obtaining data that's in the public domain. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about this later this afternoon, but let me just show you a couple things related to this. So this data is the energy intensity, which is expressed as kilowatt hours per million gallons. For each hydrologic zone within the state of California. This information comes from the California Public Utility Commission. It's part of the water energy calculator that Navigant developed for the CPUC. So this information is publicly available. And the one thing to note here, the primary thing I want you to know is that, while the energy intensity varies across the state, for the most part, there's just a 2-fold variation for most of the hydrologic zones. And also to note that, on average, this is between 1 and 2,000 kilowatt hours per million gallons. So this is publicly available data. And so what we did as part of a data challenge, which I'll talk a little bit more about this afternoon, is we took that data and we combined it with data that was submitted to the State Water Board as part of the governor's mandated 25% water reduction in 2015. And we looked so we obtained that data as well, and we looked at how much water was saved during that period from that data, and that's 23.9%. So we missed the target of 25, but it was really close. So we then combined that information with the information that was publicly available through the CPUC, and we translated that water savings into an energy savings over here. And so if you think, how many kilowatt hours per million gallons in the CPUC, if you just multiply that number by the water savings, you end up with energy savings. And then we took some additional information that was publicly available, which is shown here, related to the energy savings associated with all the investor-owned energy efficiency programs for a defined period of time, which is this quarter right here. So this is the overall energy savings for that quarter. So this is all their energy efficiency programs. So them rolling out compact fluorescent light bulbs, LEDs, them giving you rebates for adopting certain types of washing machines and dishwashers, things like that. And then we compared that to the energy savings associated for that same time period, the energy savings associated with a 25% reduction in water statewide. And the numbers are almost identical, which is interesting. So a water reduction, a 25% water reduction resulted in the same energy savings as all the investor-owned energy utilities. So you could begin to glean additional results just by combining different data sets together. These are publicly available. I'm going to skip that because I'll talk more about it this afternoon. So now let me just give you an example of the analysis of public and private data. So what's shown here is we took information from the city of Davis, and this information was essentially account level water usage. So we had people's names and addresses and their water use for a defined period of time, and we merged that with census level data, so from the U.S. Census Bureau. Specifically their decennial census data for 2010, and they also collect additional data on a 5-year basis called the ACS data, American Community Survey data. So let me start over here on the far right-hand side, this schematic here. And so this expresses the effective dollars per CCF as a function of water use. So CCF is 100 cubic feet of water. It's the common form of, that's the common unit used in the urban water sector in terms of how they report numbers. It's equivalent to roughly 750 gallons of water. So this effective dollars per CCF, the way you can think of it is, most of us get water bills where we pay a fixed charge and a variable charge. The fixed charge is just, $10, $15, $20 a month. That's what we all pay. The variable charge is how many dollars per CCF. And so based on how much water you use, you multiply that by the dollars per CCF, and that's how much you have to pay. So to think of this, so the effective dollars per CCF, the way you can think of this is, if Greg is a very good water user and he uses 1 CCF a month, and he lives in the city of Davis, his fixed charge is $10, and roughly the variable charge is $1 per CCF. So he uses 1 CCF, he pays 10 plus $1, he pays $11. The effective dollars per CCF, you divide $11 by 1 CCF, he pays $11 per CCF. I, on the other hand, don't use water very efficiently. I use 100 CCF a month. I pay $10 plus $100. I pay $110. You divide it by 100 CCF. I pay $1.10 a CCF. So Greg and I are paying very different amounts per CCF. That's what's referred to as the effective dollars per CCF over here. Each of these dots is an individual account. There's roughly 19,000 accounts in the city of Davis. So this is account level information that's been anonymized but not aggregated. And we're expressing it as the water use for each of these different accounts. This vertical line right here reflects the water that you have to use, where if you're on this side of the line, everyone pays roughly the same amount. And on this side of the line right here, everyone is paying not the same amount, and you're paying more than all the people over here. So, so this gets at equity and proportionality. Proportionality as it relates to Prop 218, which says that all of us need to pay, the fee charged to a particular parcel needs to reflect the cost of service to that parcel. So the first thing that you could begin to look at is potentially there's a proportionality issue, because in concept, why would these people be paying more for their water than these people over here? There might be some good reasons, but it begins to really question this idea of proportionality as it relates to Prop 218. The other thing that we were interested in is this idea of equity. So if you look down here, this is a histogram of water use expressed as a function of how much water people use. So if you add all this, so this vertical line here corresponds to this vertical line here. So what this is saying is roughly 50% of the people that fall, the number of people that fall on this side of the line are roughly 50% of the people in the city of Davis. So roughly 50% of the people are paying more for their water relative to the other 50%. We then compared that, so what's shown up here is we merged this data, which is on an account level, we aggregated it up to a census block or census block group, and we began to look at relationships with different types of census measures. So what's shown here is the proportion, right here, the proportion of households that fall on this side of the line within a given census block expressed as the median family income. And you can begin to see a relationship here, an inverse relationship. So the more you make, the more a given census block makes, the fewer and fewer people fall on this side of the line, meaning that more and more people over here, more and more people fall on that side of the line. The equity issue here is, what this is basically saying is that more wealthy people are paying less for their water than less wealthy people. So there's potentially an equity issue here as well. So this gets at the broader issue of water rates, and that's a big topic here in the state of California right now. And what this is getting at is if you could begin to combine public data with private data, you can really begin to develop sound policies around what water rates actually might look like or what they should look like to ensure both proportionality as it relates to our state constitution as well as the equity issue, which we're all very interested in. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let me hit two quick things real quick. So this comes now to entirely private data, and so what's shown here is this is the energy intensity over here. This is the energy intensity according to a pressure zone for the city of Otay. So these white lines are a pressure zone. The energy intensity, I know you can't read this, but it goes from about 1,000 kilowatt hours to up to about 12,000 kilowatt hours. Otay, so the border with Mexico is down here, San Diego's up here. So what you'll note here is that, so this is entirely private data. It in part reflects critical infrastructure. So if you have the necessary security or the necessary, if you abide by the necessary policies and laws, you can get access to this type of data. And so what's shown here is the energy intensity expressed on a pressure zone basis. It varies from 1,000 to 12,000 kilowatt hours per million gallons. So if you look back to the first image I showed you, which was the energy intensity related to obtained from the water energy calculator that was publicly available, you begin to see that there's a huge discrepancy between what the data actually is and what the publicly available data is, which is the best guess or an aggregated value. So it's not to say it's bad, but you can begin to see how with access to more refined data, you really can begin to refine the level of information that you can get out of the data. So I just want to end with this slide. So as we begin to look at public data, private data, and really beginning to enable greater access of all of us to that data, so the big challenge here is how can you combine public data with private data into an open platform? And that might sound silly and totally, unattainable, but actually I personally think it actually is attainable. And so the key is going back to that slide where if you recognize that there's three classes of data and you understand the policies and laws that abide by that, and if you could build a platform that abided by those, you can actually create a platform that would allow access to both public and private data to a much broader group of people. And the real key challenges here are understanding that there's different classes of information and what the laws and policies are that govern those different classes of information. And there's also different end uses to that data. We're all going to use the data in different ways. And how we use that data is, then impacts the laws and policies that apply as well. So if you could begin to blend those two together and understand the policies and laws, you can actually begin to create a platform where you can actually share this data. So our goal, internal UC Davis, I just worked through a couple of quick use cases. Our long-term goal is to create this platform and to begin to populate with public and private data and to then make that open to all of you and others to access that data in some way. So I'll end there. Thank you.